You called it a life-changing experience. How did it change your life?
I started reading it and I couldn't put it down. What excited me was this clever combination of mechanism design and cryptography that enabled this system to literally run itself, really. This is the first time in history that someone created a system which was seemingly run not by a single company or a government, but by a distributed set of parties. Tokenization, RWA, is, I think, going to be the first major mainstream use case for crypto. I mean, that's something I'm very, very excited about. The people who start work on this today are going to reap the benefits 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line. It's a great time to be entering the industry.
What are you bullish on in the Web3 space overall at the moment? And what would you say is overrated?
Yeah, I mean,
Hey, Sohail here. Thanks for tuning in. Real quick before we begin, if you enjoyed this episode, if you learned something, please consider to follow or subscribe or share this episode. That helps us out a lot. It helps us to reach more people and to spread quality education across the space about crypto and Web3. Also, if you're part of a crypto project or represent one and you would like to come on the show or do sponsoring, please get in touch with us. And lastly, everything we talk about today is for educational purposes and no financial advice. Enjoy the show. Anurag, so good to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on the show, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Man, I'm excited about this. I mean, I just told you I had your co-founder Prabal on last year. So, is there any more co-founders we have to have on? Or are we through now?
No, we just have the two co-founders. So yeah, I mean, it completes the full circle, I guess.
Yeah, completes the dynamic duo, I guess. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to talk about, really. You've been around for a long time in crypto. I mean, you've co-founded Polygon, you've co-founded Avail. So, yeah, I'm just interested to get into all that. But I heard that you started your crypto journey with reading Mastering Bitcoin, and you called it a life-changing experience. How did it change your life?
Yeah, I mean, in the sense, I entered crypto back in 2017. At the time, it was primarily Bitcoin, of course, a few other projects, and Ethereum, of course. So. My fellow co-founder at Polygon, JD or Jayanti, he kind of, we were at the time working on some ideas at the same co-working space in general, and he was working on something crypto related, and he asked me kind of, just to kind of take a look at mastering Bitcoin. Until then, I had worked with blockchains a bit, while I was with my previous company, which was in regulatory technology. So, just presenting to some regulators around blockchain. But, my understanding about blockchains was primarily around, how enterprise blockchains worked and that kind of stuff. I didn't really get into the rabbit hole of public blockchain and crypto in general. And so when I read that book, actually, in fact, it was so engrossing that actually I remember I read it in overnight, really. Like, basically, I started reading it and I couldn't put it down in general. And I think the main thing that kind of struck me was that here was this opportunity. Like, I mean, if you look at Bitcoin's history, right? Like, someone who we don't yet know build this system out of seemingly out of nowhere, really, and has created like 2 trillion of value today. I mean, it will grow even bigger, for example, and it's really mechanism to coordinate value. Like, it stood for various things at various points in time. Started off as a payment system, maybe as a revolt against all the 2008 bank bailouts and stuff like that, right? So it was certainly a cypherpunk sort of a thing, but really what excited me was this clever combination of mechanism design and cryptography that enabled this system to literally run itself, really, right? Like, I mean, it doesn't need to have a central party. So when I read that, really, and understood the Bitcoin architecture at a very deep level, and Ethereum was already around at that time. And I thought, I mean, if Bitcoin, we can do like Bitcoin for money, and Ethereum is more general purpose. And at the time, Ethereum was going through one of its first scaling throws. Like there was this game called CryptoKitties or NFTs called CryptoKitties that had blown up, like congested Ethereum, so to speak. And like I thought, this technology could be used. It could be used to re-architect how finance works, in the like in the world today, right? Like, I mean, what I sincerely believe is that the world, I mean, it's not what I believe really. It's actually true that the world runs on ledgers, all kinds of ledgers. Every bank has a ledger. Every stock exchange has a ledger. Every system of record has some sort of ledger where they kind of like track value, transfer value, track value, store value, that sort of a thing, right? Like, and this is the first time in history that someone created a system and which was seemingly run not by a single company or a government, but by like by a distributed set of parties, who had incentives and disincentives. And that could be very powerful infra for kind of replacing some of the systems that we have in general. And to me it was like just a mind-blowing opportunity that I couldn't get like I couldn't leave, really.
Fascinating. And how did you go from there to finding your co-founders and starting Polygon?
Yeah, I mean, it happened very quickly. To be very honest, like after this happened, like 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 I said, my fellow co-founder at Polygon, JD, and I used to work at the like same co-working space, right? So we were working on different things. Then like couple of months later, he said that like though Ethereum is going through one of its first scaling throws, and there is real demand going to come for layer 2 solutions. So I mean, there's a very legitimate demand for this kind of infra. So why don't you help me build this, for example? And so that's how it began. And Sandeep, our third co-founder, came in. And yeah, I mean, that's I mean, initially we didn't think it would we didn't think it would become this big, for sure. We were just three people in, yeah, actually we started this in India, in Mumbai. And we actually struggled for a lot, like for the first 2 years. Really, we didn't have too much funding. We had a very small team. Like, it was just very scrappy sort of a setup. And it's only in 2019 or so that we kind of like raised our first serious round of external funding and so on, for example. So but yeah, I mean, I kind of compare what things that I used to work with before entering crypto and the things that I get to work with in crypto. It's like like just very systems of very big scale.
Mm. I'm wondering, what is it like? I mean, you just said it was scrappy at the beginning, and then you guys launch. And what is it like to just start this crypto project, be kind of like working in this co-working space, trying to, with this vision, working on this thing, and then like starting a crypto project and then watching it become this huge thing? What is that like?
Yeah, I mean, see, in retrospective, it seems like we had like a very grand plan right at the start, and we kind of executed on this perfectly. To be very honest, like we had a hunch that Ethereum was going to see like a lot of demand. I mean, we already saw that it was congested, so there was certainly scaling required in general. And so certainly we knew that there would be demand, and that's why we kind of started building something called Plasma. It later morphed into something which you see now, which is the Polygon POS chain. And things just kind of blew up very fast, right? Like 2019, 2020. 2020 is when we launched it. We were kind of we were doing all the scrappy work. Like, I remember I was in probably north of 100, 200 Telegram groups, just helping developers build their apps, for example, like help out with their contracts and stuff like that, right? Like, at that time the tooling wasn't that mature, like in general, compared to today. And so we all did all this, and then like there is this thing that I sincerely believe in general. it's basically that there is no place, like there is no thing such as the right place at the right time, right? You have to be at the right place for a sufficiently long time so that when the right time hits, you are there to capture it, right? Like, I mean, that's really the essence, and it's true for any business, right? Like, there's no overnight success. Like, you have to keep at it in general. You, of course, you have to identify the problem area. There's a bunch of startup literature on that. For I'm a huge fan of Peter Thiel, like, who advocates basically trying to um, work or do something in an area which has zero competition, really, or close to zero competition. And typically that comes at the intersection of two fields, where, like, because generally, like, if you're an expert in one field, that field is already commoditized, right? Like, so you're trying to kind of take to these two different fields and see what makes sense at the intersection, for example. And crypto really is the intersection of finance, mechanism design, a bunch of stuff, right? Like, so if you know how to build blockchains, if you know how finance works, if you know how mechanism design works, then you can actually use it to do very smart things, right? Like, so what we ended up was in 2021, like, DeFi summer started with, like, Aave was already successful at the time on Ethereum, and it was looking for avenues to scale. And at that time, like, we had launched, for example, and DeFi. There was a lot of other DeFi teams doing a bunch of cool stuff. Very expensive on Ethereum, very cheap on Polygon, for example. And so a lot of users I have talked to post that, have come back to me saying, like, we entered blockchain because, like, we couldn't pay fees on Ethereum, but, like, Polygon was very cheap. So that's when we had our first taste of DeFi. And, like, so it's just, I would say, of course, every business goes down to, of course, you need to do the hard work, you need to do the execution, for example, but timing is a very important factor. But otherwise, like, it's as with any fast growing startup, we had our own challenges. We grew too big too fast, in general, and then, of course, we did a bit of restructuring and stuff like that. But it's, like, it's a solid product. Does tons of transactions volume even today, very successful, and we've been kind of been able to do follow on products and stuff like that.
You just mentioned this. I'd like to follow up on it, which is challenges and failures. Is there like one pivotal moment, pivotal failure that comes to mind that you also like learned from?
Yeah, I mean, to be very honest, we started off with this solution called Plasma. Like, Plasma was this. It was a precursor to the roll-up technology that we see right now. It was actually proposed in a paper by Vitalik Buterin and Joseph Poon back in 2017. I mean, it just proposed the idea. It didn't give any implementation details. It was left to the teams like us to kind of figure out how to actually implement it. And so we started with that. And midway, we understood that maybe Plasma isn't implementable at all, like, with the right expressivity, with the right safety criteria, for example, and so on. And really, there were a lot of other teams trying to do Plasma implementations at the time, and of course, all of them failed. Plasma itself didn't work out. And midway, we took the in retrospective, thankfully, we took that decision to kind of create Polygon POS, which, like, served us beautifully in terms of, going anywhere. So basically, like, of course, the Plasma project was a failure, to so to speak, in general. But we were pragmatic enough to kind of, like, have a backup plan or pivot to what we knew would work, for example. So I think that was like a very big step in the history of the company in general. And then, of course, like, a bunch of other stuff that happened. But yeah, I mean, if you ask me about one big failure, it was that, like, the initial path that we started out with didn't work out. But I think it's it's true for any startup, really.
It's part of the journey.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it also sounds like, did you pivot a lot? Did you because if you're building something, you're always in a way in a state of not knowing, right? You're solving one problem, but then something else pops up. As you solve problems, new problems pop up, and you constantly come again in the you kind of go to bed with the feeling of not knowing. If you keep pushing, if you keep growing, you're probably always at this place of not knowing, and then learning it and doing it, and then not knowing the next thing. Does that characterize it a bit as well? The way you guys stayed agile and kept iterating?
Yeah, of course. See, basically, the thing is, most founders have this idea maze in their heads. So essentially, uh, in general, like founders live in the future. To be very honest, right? That's their job. Um, what we build today is not going to be used. It's going to be valuable in the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, right? That's, and the only way to kind of um, visualize this is having like this ever evolving idea maze, so that you start with something, and then you have you have to be thinking 5 steps ahead. Like you have to be modeling scenarios, for example. It seems complex, but it's like comes naturally to people like us, for example. Any founder really, because what they're already thinking is, okay, here's what I know, here's the opportunity, and these are the probable paths to where we want to be. Now, more often than not, these ideas will fail. Unfailingly. Um, and so to preempt that with let's say a backup idea or something like that, right? So that's why a lot of founders will go through pivots, for example, and stuff like that, right? But you have this vision of the world where you want the world to be, and you want to kind of map your product into that world, really. So in general, yeah, that's really so once we understood that, we had this feeling that maybe Plasma would not work out. We said we already had a test net with for Polygon POS like in 2018, and we were testing it with developers in general, and we were helping a lot of people create apps, for example, and so on. And so you need to have this continuous feedback loop in general, so that keeps you on the straight path, right? It's very hard to be building a product in the lab without talking to anyone, and then just one fine day going out and trying to sell it. It can happen, but it happens very rarely.
Yeah, gotcha. I saw a quote of yours which said, after a decade of blockchain innovation, we've made transactions faster, but we're still failing to coordinate value, identity, and agreements at scale. The problem isn't speed, it's that the roads don't connect. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, so there are essentially, if you zoom out a bit, right? If you kind of look at the landscape today in blockchain and as well as in traditional finance, in blockchains now there are like probably 200, 300 odd chains, maybe much more, right? Essentially. And all of these are, of course, some of these are different in characteristics, some of them, you need to code a program using Solidity or Viper or Rust, for example, or something like that, right? So, but in general, what they are, all of these are building are programmable ledgers, really. So essentially, some code that can run on top of a ledger. Now those ledgers could be anything. It can be used to track ERC20 tokens, or it could be used to do NFTs, for example. But essentially, fungible, non-fungible, anything really. So now, right now, we've kind of at that stage where we have this situation where we bootstrap the industry with crypto native assets, really. So because it's very hard for traditional finance to replace all of the infra with new tech, right? So we the thing people don't realize this is that the these crypto native assets that we ended up issuing, for example, those are the things that we kind of use in for as inputs to all these Legos that came, right? Like, so it's not just BTC transfers or ETH transfers. It's basically, you can do a smart contract on top of Ethereum. You can put Ethereum into ETH into a smart contract, take a loan against it, for example. Then use the loan to deploy it somewhere else, for example. So you have this very complex, like programmable applications now already live, right? Like, and because these assets have value, have some value, intrinsic value. I mean, whether it is speculative driven or intrinsic, doesn't matter, but these have some value. And then there's a reasonably big set of customers who are drawn to this, who come and trade assets, who come and interact with DeFi, do various kinds of stuff. Of course, all of this is, like incentives and disincentives, that people have come up with, right? Like, projects have incentives, for example, and so on. And the thing is that what has led to the current stage is now there's too many chains, and a lot of these chains don't talk to each other at all, really. So it's sometimes it happens that the same protocol is on 10 different chains. Like, something like an Aave is on 11 or 12 different chains, for example. It's the same exact protocol, same exact code, but it has to live across all these chains because, like, Aave doesn't want its users, like, doesn't want to lose users from a particular chain, for example. From a TradFi perspective, it's actually much more fragmented, to be very honest. Like, your money sits on a different ledger in a bank or with the central bank, for example. Your stock, if you own stocks, that sits on a different ledger, for example. If you own mutual funds, if you own bonds, all of these sit on different ledgers, and then all of them have to kind of communicate to kind of get something done. So that's the reason why when you do a stock trade, it takes T+2 days to kind of finally settle the trade, because your money has to move in a different ledger. Your stock has to move in a different ledger, and then all of that has to be reconciled, for example. So it's kind of like similar, in the sense that in traditional finance, all of these are on different ledgers. In blockchain, what has happened is the same infra is replicated on each ledger, for example. And so now assets are fragmented. Like, users have assets on 10 different chains. So it's just very hard. It used to make sense when there was just Ethereum and a few other chains. Now, with 200 chains, 300 chains, 400 chains, like, it's very hard. So that's really what I'm trying to kind of convey, is that essentially, we have to kind of like resolve this in a way that all of these get connected seamlessly, and so that like we instead of worrying about users having to think about 100 chains or 10 chains or whatever, right? Like, I mean, they can just use the app, right? Like, I mean, you don't, when you log into your favorite stock trading app, like maybe Robinhood, for example, or something similar, you don't think about like where Robinhood has hosted their infra. Is it on Google? Is it on AWS? Doesn't matter, right? Like, you're just wanting to use the app. And I think that moment has come, in the sense that we have a lot of infrastructure. Now we have to kind of connect this together in the service of like great apps.
Is that one of the motivations behind Avail? That's the project you co-founded and you're working on now?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. One of the core aspects for Avail, when we began, actually, we began Avail within Polygon, really, back in 2020. It was just a small project when we started, with only 4 people on the project, but then we kind of built it out, and in 2023 we decided to spin it out, in general.
I remember. Sorry, I talked about this with Prabal, and he said that there was a problem around credible neutrality. If we wanted to be a DA layer, but you were under Polygon, it seemed difficult to onboard other projects, so to say.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, in general, like, why we began Avail in the first place was we were of course working at Polygon. We were actively working on layer 2 solutions, so like the Polygon CDK, for example, and so on. And we realized that rollups, so there are two types of scaling in blockchains really. Like there's vertical scaling and there's horizontal scaling. So some projects like Solana, Aptos, Sui are taking the vertical scaling approach. Projects like Ethereum and Avail, and Polygon and Arbitrum, etc., are taking the horizontal scaling approach. So what does that really mean? Is that instead of making your single chain like big fat, like parallelized and so on, basically we have like tens and hundreds of chains, so that you can have as much scale as you require really. And that's in a way very similar to how web 2 apps really work, right? Like, I mean, like something like a Facebook or like even Riverside, on which we are chatting on, probably has a few hundred servers running in various locations across the world, and that's how they horizontally scale. And so we thought like, so that is the right approach to kind of scaling blockchains. But we also understood that Ethereum began life as a like a monolithic blockchain, really, and it then pivoted into this whole roll-up centric roadmap. And we sensed then the need, that for infra that roll-ups would require to grow. And that's how we kind of actually started Avail, in the sense that roll-ups would be everywhere, and we are already seeing that play out in 2025, right? Like you have north of 200 300 roll-ups, because it's just very easy to launch a layer 2 solution or roll-up rather than just doing a brand new L1, just because it's that much easy and inexpensive in general. So that was where we started. And but the core differentiator we of course started with the Avail DA layer, the base layer in general, because which was a scalability play. But we always wanted to build in native interoperability, which Ethereum currently lacks. Because like if you have all these chains, even if you have 200 chains, if they're not connected to each other, then they are, like from a user point of view, they are still different chains. And what we really wanted to build towards is, like let us build infra to have tens and hundreds of chains, and then let us build infra that connects all of these to create a network. So what we are really building right from the outset is really, I mean, of course, the industry tries to slot each project in some categories that they can understand. At the time when we launched, DA was the hot category at the moment, and so, but we've always, if you look at our documentation, our vision, our white paper, we've always been about building this network of chains. And so that's what our upcoming product, actually we just released the beta today, is for connecting all these chains together.
Is that Avail Nexus?
Correct.
Okay, because I read about that. You had a few blog posts. What's special about Nexus? What would you highlight? I know there's some interesting stuff around, like you said, like cross-chain communication and simplifying this. I think there's ZK proofs as well that play a role. But yeah, what would you highlight there, and what benefits are you seeing already?
Yeah, I think, see, mainly, if I want to boil this down to like a couple of simple, or simple objectives, really, right? Like, so one is, like how can we enable users to use an app on a particular chain, even if their assets are on other chains, for example, to kind of like seamlessly use the app without, and getting their assets bridged without having to leave the app really. So essentially, like if a user is an app on Sophon, which is like a layer 2 chain on top of Avail, and if they want to use an app, but maybe their assets are, maybe they have stable coins on Base, for example. So now the typical workflow today would be, they would go to a bridge interface, leave the app, go to a bridge interface, find the way to bridge from base to Sophon, come back to the app, for example, and then do the action, right? Like we want to kind of completely change this flow. What we want to be able to do is have the user click a button inside of the app, which kind of takes the action to kind of bring the assets from base to Sophon. All of this happens in the background. User doesn't need to care. They just like do a couple of clicks and the funds are there, and it's deployed there, for example. So things like that, right? Like, I mean, it's kind of it's basically the things that we are moving from this very single chain focus to a very multi-chain environment, and really the tooling for users to be dealing with this so many number of chains hasn't evolved that well. And so what we want to really do is make it as simple as as possible for a user to access applications. Really, I mean, they don't need to know too much about where their assets are. They don't need to know about bridging, for example, and so on. We just show a unified balance. We kind of help them bridge, for example, and so on. So all of this happens very quickly, efficiently, fast in general. And so really what we want to change is the way in which developers architect their apps, users use these apps, in the sense keeping cross chain as a first class citizen, really. So in general, an Aave should not have to be on 12 different chains. Like it could be on one different chain, one single chain, and people should be able to use Aave with any assets they have on any other chains, and should be able to do the like, let's say, the deposit into Aave in one or two clicks, for example. So that's really what we want to achieve. And two, also because now there are so many chains, some infrastructure, and for each infrastructure, for each chain to bootstrap infrastructure on every chain is very hard. So you will not have Aave on 100 chains, you'll have Aave on 12 chains. You will not have Uniswap on 100 chains, you'll have it on 10 or 20. And so basically for those chains that don't have access to this kind of infra, how can those users get access to this, right? Like, so basically if you have USDC and you want to convert it into ETH on, let's say, Sophon, can I use the Uniswap instance on Lens, for example, to kind of swap and send it back, right? Like without me having to manually bridge, swap it, send it back, for example, and so on. So essentially, how can we help bring liquidity or assets from other chains into a particular chain or to the app, for example? Just make it easy for the developer, for the user. And two is, if a chain lacks infra that is important, like a Uniswap, like a Aave, how can they access it and get the functionality, right? Like, so a bunch of things that we're trying to solve.
That sounds powerful. I mean, yeah, UX is a big issue still across chains, like you said. Are you tackling that first in terms of chains that are connected to Avail DA, or is it also other blockchains like Ethereum, Solana, and so on?
Yeah, initially when we, to be very honest, when we started out back a couple of years ago, we thought we would build this for only the chains that were going to be using Avail DA, essentially. But as we were kind of iterating over the design, over the implementation, it turned out that we could the most valuable chains that we needed to integrate with were basically the chains which had where users had assets on. And if we didn't connect to those chains, it would be difficult to get liquidity or assets from, for example. And so then it literally turned out that we now, with Nexus, we are able to connect to a Base and Arbitrum and Ethereum,
and hopefully in the coming days to Omega ETH, to Hyperliquid, to BNB, like soon Katana, so on, right? Like, so essentially, so I don't think we are constrained by just the chains that use Avail DA.
Can you explain a bit how that works technically, the approach? I read it's like intent-based stuff, but also ZK proofs that you leverage. And then also how it accrues value to Avail, because I mean, not necessarily in the case where you do the cross-chain messaging across your own ecosystem, but when you enable cross-chain messaging across other ecosystems, I mean, there should also be a mechanism where it benefits the protocol or the Avail or the ecosystem, right? So I'm wondering how it does, but also just the technical solution behind it.
Yeah. So initially, when we started, we actually began with a very ZK proof aggregation based architecture. When we started, this is back in 2023. We at that time we thought that ZK rollups would be winning, and all chains would be ZK rollups, and so we should be able to do a ZK proof aggregation play and so on. But as we have kind of iterated over the implementation and how the blockchain landscape has evolved, it's not only ZK rollups, it's also optimistic rollups, other L1 chains, for example, and so on. So we kind of had to change our strategy, in general. And so right now we use TEs. This is basically trusted execution environments, like hardware based in general. To provide like to verify each chain, we use TEs, and on top of it we use an intent based model. So for specifically in terms of architecture, like we use TEs for native message passing, and then essentially we use this liquidity pool based model for fungible token transfers, essentially. So think for fungible token or ERC20s, we use a more liquidity pool based model, and for the native message passing we use TEs for now. But at a later point in time, when ZK VMs and proving systems become a little bit more performant in terms of faster proving, cheaper costs, for example, we will replace the TE backend with a ZK backend, essentially. So that's the high level flow, but happy to get into more details. For the value accrual, essentially, this gives more value accrual to the Avail token. Really, in general, we kind of not only within our chains, Avail ecosystem of chains that use Avail DA, any transaction, cross-chain transaction across chains that we support, even on a base, on an Arbitrum, for example, we kind of there are fees that are paid by the user or by the developer on behalf of the user, and a portion of that, essentially, after adjusting for costs, it goes back to all of those goes back to the the Avail ecosystem, Avail token and value accrual.
How exactly does that work? Is it like programmatically like a fee that's paid on a cross-chain?
Correct. Yeah. So part of the fees are kind of basically are used for this. Correct. Right now, the first iteration of the product uses the source chain token, but at a later point in time we will have revenues from that flow into the Avail token treasury and stuff like that.
Okay, interesting. And what happens on the TE? I'm familiar with TEs, but I'm just like, how do you leverage this kind of like secure element? Like, what happens there in terms of the not native message passing, but
correct. Yeah. No, so what happens really is that for any sort of interop system to work, in general, what you really require is, so if I go through the landscape of different protocols, right? Like, so what you really want is some entity in the middle to be watching all these chains, basically listening to events on these chains, typically running a full node of each chain, essentially, so that you basically re-execute those transactions and verify if the chain execution is correct or not, right? Like, because what happens is, let's say you want to send some fund, let's say some USDT from, let's say, base to Sophon, for example. Now what happens is that, like, how will any transfer, cross-chain transfer happen? You need like a third party to be kind of who is watching both base and Sophon, and you want to be very sure that, let's say if a user has sent Base, they want to send some USDT on Base to Sophon, they will initiate a transaction. Now, whether the transaction has gone through is correct, for example, or no, only if in that event, for example, do you have to send the transaction on Sophon, like to basically you have to send the USDT on Sophon, right? Like, so there are two parts to any cross chain transfer, really. So there's a source transfer and there's a destination transfer, and so you cannot, and all these have to be in a sense sequenced correctly. Like, I mean, essentially, if the source chain transaction fails, you have to you cannot do the destination chain transfer, for example. And so you use some mechanism to verify that the source chain transaction is correct, and then the destination transaction is correct to complete the flow, for example. Now, various teams, various projects use various different ways of doing this. So someone like a layer 0 or a wormhole will use like a multi-sig based approach. So for example, wormhole has, I think, around 19 guardians, out of which 13 need to sign, for example. Or layer 0, I don't know the exact specifics, but they have like a 3x5, or I'm not very sure, but some sort of multi-sig in general. And so and like XLR does it with running a Cosmos chain. Each of the validators checks that, for example. But essentially what all of these are doing is they're checking whether the transaction on the first chain was correct, and then then only the second transaction has to be triggered, and then whether the second transaction went through, for example. So this is basically the chain execution verification part. What do we do with TEs, and later what we plan to do with ZK VMs is essentially get a succinct proof whether the transaction execution was correct or not. So we actually, from a very practical angle, we run the full node of the chain inside of a TE. So instead of it running standalone, we can
both of them. Are you running the base full node in the TE and the?
We run chains of all full nodes of all the chains that we support
on the same TE.
It depends, right? Like, I mean, different TEs have different hardware capabilities. So we may be able to run on a decently provisioned machine. We might be able to run, let's say, 4 or 5 full nodes on some. I mean, it totally depends.
Okay. So you run the both full nodes on the TE, and then you have a code executing there, which basically checks, okay, did that transfer happen on the base chain? Yes, and then it issues on the other node the transaction destination transfer to in sequence to issue the other transaction.
Correct. I mean, there's a few more parts to it in general. I mean, because we also did this liquidity pool based model, so there is an additional infra or participants called solvers in the network, for example.
Yeah, that's intent based.
Yeah. So basically, like settlement between, like in general coordination between the solvers, like all of that also happens within the TEs, for example, and so on. So there's a bunch of stuff, but yeah.
Super interesting. Yeah, because I'm also I work on another project as well, which is a decentralized AI project called Oda AI. Basically, we use ZK proofs to verify the attestation reports that the TE generates, and then we can trust the verification logic because it's run in a ZK circuit. I think ZK is really interesting. Obviously, you must think that as well. If you had the vision early on that it might all switch to ZK, like you said, and then turns out there's still optimistic rollups and so on.
Yeah, I mean, basically, certainly ZK is going to win. It depends upon the time scale in general. I think lots of work is being done, like a bunch of ZKVM teams now racing to prove Ethereum blocks in real time, for example, and so on. So, I mean, the cost, performance is going up, the cost is coming down. So I think basically once the tech is ready, we should be able to incorporate that in our architecture as well.
Yeah. What's the bottleneck? Is it like at the moment some of these cryptographic verifications that have to be run are slower in the ZK circuit?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, a lot of the big roll-ups or chains, for example, right? Like, so it depends, like which systems you're talking about. Like let's say most EVM systems, like have now some sort of prover that is ready. For example, it just takes too much hardware to compute proofs in, like let's say, like for Ethereum, for example, the block time is 12 seconds. So so you could like for one of the like better players in the industry, for example, right now you have to use 40 to 50 GPUs to prove a Ethereum block in 12 seconds, for example. So it's pretty you need a lot of computation, really. And then basically, if you don't put in that much hardware, then it just takes more time, right? Like so you need to, yeah. So it's basically both have to come down, right? Like, so proving time has to go down, need for this much hardware has to go down, for example. Like, it's basically all results into costs in general. And so as and when that happens, yeah, I mean, essentially it should be easy to switch over.
Yeah. There's a lot of research as well on ZK in LLM context. So with AI models to like ZKML and stuff. So basically run the whole model in a ZK circuit, but it is it's just not viable yet, I think, because the models are too large.
Yeah, models are too large. I mean, it's very hard. It's not that easy, I would say.
Yeah, but it's super interesting. What are you sort of like bullish on in the Web3 space overall at the moment? And what would you say is overrated?
I think in general, for the last 3-4 years, we've seen the rise in stablecoin issuance. And things have really gone mainstream this year and the last, like companies like Stripe, Robinhood, all entering the arena. Like Stripe brought out Bridge, and they bought out Privy, for example. They released stablecoin accounts in 100 plus countries, for example. Robinhood was just yesterday announced, like tokenized stocks and stuff like that, right? So as I said, right, like we are getting to the stage where we've been kind of experimenting with a lot of natively issued crypto assets over the last 5-10 years, right? Like, I mean, if you see all of DeFi, it's really like, so there are broadly 3 or 4 categories. Of course there are many more. I'm just saying main categories of activity in blockchains. One is, of course, trading these stocks, these tokens, for example, which is like, let's say, a Binance or a Dexes, for example, and so on. Then there is more complex, like DeFi um, protocols or infrastructure, for example. Then there's, of course, like collectible category, NFTs and such, for example, and so on. And of course, a lot of other important categories. But in general, the thing is that the most that we have kind of stress tested this infra is on things like DeFi. I mean, there have been so many hacks, so many like real world simulations of hacks, for example, right? Like, so over the years, that some of the infra has been battle tested with actual value on, and it's very different from having getting this code audited by audit firms, right? Like, I mean, that's not it. This is like real world testing. And I think basically that, coupled with the maturity in stablecoin infra, so it's not only the rise in stablecoin minting, like we've reached around 240 to 50 billion dollars in stablecoins, but it's also the infra around it, like OTC infra, on ramps, off ramps, going from USD to USDT, USDT to back to USD, for example, other country GBP stable coins, yen stable coin, for example, and so on. So now basically these worlds are converging. Like, so we kind of battle tested all this infra, financial infra, DeFi infra, with assets that we were minted natively. Now the thing is that because now stablecoins have gone mainstream, now people will ask in the next couple of years is like, we can do payments with the USDC and USDT. What more can we do on top? How can we get yield, for example? How can we, like take out loans against some of these things that we have, for example? So it's
or use applications, decentralized dApps and stuff.
yeah. So it's basically, I think the thing I'm most excited about is we will end up replicating a lot of like financial infra and instruments. I think basically blockchains are much better infra for a lot of these use cases, because just by the simple fact that all of these can live on like a single global ledger, in general, as opposed to like if you want to do a stock trade, you have to integrate with the stock exchange API. The API has to talk to the banking API to get the funds, for example, and so on. So basically, I think this is going to blow up. Of course, it's going to take a little bit more time. I mean, everyone is excited about RWA and tokenized stocks and stuff like that. But there's a bunch of infra. It's not really just cryptographic infra. It's also a lot of market structure infra, right? Like there's things like liquidity pools, market making, de-risk engines, liquidation engines, so on and so forth.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, and it looks like you're building sort of the rails for that as well with Avail. You've had, I mean, I think you have like 100 plus ecosystem partnerships now, big community, like 665,000 members, I believe. What's some of the partnerships which are exciting to you at the moment, showcasing the tech, and what's next that's kind of interesting?
I think last year we, once we launched our product on Mainnet, we were working on getting more and more chains on board on top of our Avail DA product. So essentially, so we have now around 10, 11 chains on Mainnet. At the moment, we have 50 more chains launching on Mainnet this year and early next year in general. And with Nexus, we are now starting to kind of create this network of chains. So we are connecting each of them together, for example. And of course, as I mentioned, we will also start connecting other L2s and L1s, for example. The general intent is that we want to make it easy for any developer to access, to enable their users to bring in their assets from anywhere to use this app, for example, right? Like, so that is and make it very dead simple, right? Like, it doesn't have, the UX doesn't have to be very complex. I like to give this example almost on every podcast, really. Is I go back to this Apple Pay example. Like before Apple Pay, you had to carry your credit card or debit card, for example, everywhere you wanted to pay, right? Like now you just kind of like bring out your phone and tap and it's done, really. And the thing is that it's so easy for the customer, but people don't realize how much infrastructure it goes behind in enabling that, like tap to pay experience. I mean, there's machinery at the POS, at the retailer, for example. There's payment processor stuff. There's bank. It hits the banking system. It hits the credit card system. Like, so bunch of things get done, but like it happens so fast that people don't really care.
They just want to go boop. Boop.
Yes, exactly. And so that is the thing, right? Like, I mean, essentially, with crypto, you are building brand new rails, and you are kind of trying to bring utility, useful applications on this. But you are competing with an Apple Pay and other financial instruments when like it comes to real mind share, right? Like, this is not, if you want, this is not just, if you want this to remain a niche category, sure. I mean, you can go through a MetaMask and all through that complexity. But if you want to get to mainstream, you are competing against some of these established counterparts, and you have to give a similar experience. Otherwise, you don't stand a chance. that's why someone like Robinhood coming in makes news, because like they have the distribution and they will not have you download a MetaMask wallet, right? Like, I mean, they will just embed it within the Robinhood app. So essentially, that's something I'm very, very excited about. I think tokenization, RWA, essentially is, I think, going to be the first major mainstream use case for crypto. I mean, in a sense, in a niche sense, stablecoins already are pretty successful, but I think this is going to be like a big, big, big wave. A lot of valuable companies going to be built on this.
Yeah, it's an exciting time. A lot of catalysts right now. I think, like you said, there's Robinhood with their own chain, and I think Kraken, Bybit. That there's, I think, a lot of names entering at the moment in a short span of time. Super exciting. Thank you so much, Anurag, for coming on the show. It's been really interesting to learn more about Avail, and it's exciting to hear so many chains are going to be spinning up this year. I think you mentioned 15 or something.
50.
50. Oh, Jesus.
Yeah.
I'm going to pass out. You got to stop. Yeah, any last words you want to share?
I think in general, it's like a very exciting time to be in the industry at the moment. I think basically there is certainly a section of the industry which will be very focused on its cypherpunk roots in general, like more decentralized, more censorship resistant. But increasingly there's going to be a part of the industry that focuses on integrating into mainstream utility usage, for example, and that will come from a lot of RWA, real world assets, getting onto blockchain ledgers really. And I think this is, like, as you have seen the rise of stable coins in general, a similar trajectory will be there for real world asset tokens. So people who are in or on the fence are in working in traditional finance or in the crypto space in general, really, as I said at the outset, you need to compete in areas with like zero competition, as Peter Thiel says. Like what that really means is, like, when I actually read it for his book Zero to One for the first time, I didn't really understand like zero competition, like what is a field with zero competition. But it like you only experience it once you kind of like go through this cycle, right? Like, and typically this comes at, again, as I said, at the intersection of two fields, and here this is essentially intersection of finance and blockchains, ledger, distributed ledger technology. And essentially, if you an like expert in either, you have to kind of look for opportunities in both sides and see what can be ported over really. And like the people who start work on this today are going to reap the benefits 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line. So I think yeah, my thing would be like basically it's a great time to be entering the industry if you are interested.
Love that. Very optimistic outlook. Very good. Good times ahead. Thank you so much, Anurag.
Thank you for having me.